Junko stopped the car in front of his mansion. Wyan looked at him and nodded her head. They were in front of Junko's and Anhi mansion. He said, grinning ear to ear. Wyan nodded her head and exited the car. She was feeling really nervous now. Junko reached for her hands and smiled at her. They entered inside the mansion and welcomed by his dog Bam. Bam immediately ran to Jungkook and started jumping in the attempt to hug him. Vine smiled looking at Bam, who immediately came to her and sat down. Jungkook looked at her confused and felt something different. Vine's smile faded away a bit hearing those words from Jungkook. She remembered Anhi used to complain about Bam's behavior towards her. Jungkook looked at her constantly waiting for answer. Jungkook nodded his head, but now he was feeling weird. He shook his head, trying to remove all the thoughts from his mind, but his mind kept thinking about everything. He thought, looking at Vian. Jungkook placed his hand over the railing, stared at the sky. He whispered under his breath. He sat annoyed at himself, closing his eyes, trying to forget about Vian. Vian said, entering the terrace. He looked at her and nodded his head. Vian stopped at her track and looked back at him. Jungkook took his step close to her and pulled her into a hug. Jungkook snuggled his face more to her neck and breathed slowly, smelling her familiar scent. His eyes filled with tears. It hurt too much, but it was felt like coming home, knowing he will be safe with her. Knowing she was there no matter what, he felt like they belonged to each other. Like everything is right, like nothing bad happened between them, nothing. Junko confessed as he sniffed on her hair. She sobbed, she felt like breaking down. She wanted Junko to comfort her, to hold her in his arms, to know that she isn't alone. She wanted him to know that she wasn't Anhi, but she can't. She tried calming Jungkook down and caressed his raven hair gently, trying to ease his pain. He nodded his head, holding on to her even tighter. After some moment, he pulled away. He smiled and led her to dinner. Mr. Min looked at the invitation card and sighed. Mrs. Min looked at her husband and smiled softly. She placed a hand top of Mr. Min's. She paused for a second. She looked at her husband. He bowed his head low slightly when holding on his wife's hand tightly. Mrs. Jun said, looking at Vian in a bridal gown. She bowed slightly, smiling nervously. She chuckled lightly at her. She asked herself, worrying what Jungkook will do once he finds out about her lie. Ryan sighed and nodded her head. Ryan smiled, remember how she was close to Jun's family. Jungkook and Ryan were so close to each other before Anhee came to Jungkook's life. He said while coming out of the bathroom after having a shower. He shook his head while entering his closet. He smiled when his eyes landed on his wedding suit. He exclaimed excitedly. He started pulling the black suit off the hanger and threw it on the bed and went back to the closet to take other stuff but stopped when he pulled out of the box and a frame fell down. His eyes widened, seeing him and Anhi in a wedding dress smiling widely. His cheeks turned red, remembering what just happened to them the first time they kissed, the first time he fell for Anhi, and the first time she fell for Jungkook. He said, staring at the picture he was holding in his hands. Suddenly, a sharp pain hit on his head, and he immediately grabs his hair. Jungkook fell on the floor and groaned in pain while holding on to his head. He heard a voice coming closer. Jungkook opened his eyes, which were red due to tears and pain. He sobbed. Van looked at the gate in worry. Jungkook wasn't there. They all were worried about him. Her heart was pounding uncontrollably against her chest. She was scared of everything. She thought and heaved a deep breath. Van looked at her mother and nodded her head. Soon Jungkook entered with a straight face. His aura was different from before, which wasn't unnoticed by Ryan. Jungkook walked to the hallway and stood in front of Ryan. She looked at him and smiled, but his expression didn't change. She asked, looking into his dark eyes. He replied, looking at her with his cold eyes. He smiled at him. He looked at the group of people surrounding them for blessing. He said and nodded his head in reply. She answered softly, bowing her head. He said, making Ryan look at Jungkook, who was staring at her deeply. He took his few steps closer to her and held her waist tightly before giving her a small peck on her lips. He whispered into her ear and moved back.